Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk, particularly to this group. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries radically transformed our conception of the relation between appearance and reality. The new physics, pioneered by Galileo and Descartes and raised to a powerful systematic pinnacle by Newton, achieved its unprecedented explanatory successes by redescribing the natural world in a variety of mathematical vocabularies. This decisive advance in the scientific conception of reality was accompanied by a radical metamorphosis in the philosophical understanding of the relation between that physical reality and its appearance to the human subjects who'd come to understand the world so much better by deploying those new vocabularies. A key element in the early modern philosophers' response to the rise of the new science was to move from thinking of appearance in terms of its resemblance to reality to thinking of it in terms of its representation of reality. The home of the appearance-reality distinction lies in specifically perceptual appearances. Veridical perceptual experience, in which things appear as they really are, is not only a necessary condition of empirical knowledge, but also its principal source. But perceptual appearances also sometimes mislead by diverging from reality. The circular coin looks elliptical, the distant tower is larger than it appears, the color of the cloth turns out not to be what in bad lighting it was taken to be. Since the Greeks, the idea had been that, at least when things go well, the way things appear to us resembles the way they really are, on the model of pictures. Resemblance here can be understood as the sharing of some properties, as a realistic portrait might reproduce the shapes of facial features, the nose, the jawline, or the color of clothing. Where the picturing shapes and colors replicate the shapes and colors of what's pictured, reality appears as it is. Where they diverge, appearances can be misleading. But the rise of the new science exposes the inadequacy of the resemblance model of appearance. On Copernicus's account, the reality behind the appearance of a stationary Earth and a revolving sun is a rotating Earth and a stationary sun. Being at rest and being in motion are opposites, incompatible properties that don't have anything in common. Rotating and revolving, that is, spinning and orbiting, are both kinds of circular motion, but quite different ones. The revolutionary general lesson was that astronomical reality was nothing like its appearance to us. Galileo's reading of what he called the Book of Nature, written in the language of mathematics, finds the best way of getting a grip on the reality of motion to be by manipulating geometrical appearances. For him, a period of time shows up as the length of a line, and acceleration as the area of a triangle. One could force the assimilation of temporal to spatial extension into the form of resemblance as shared properties, but I don't think any such Procrustean maneuver will make the resemblance model sufficient or even really helpful in understanding the relations between the real acceleration of a falling body and its geometrical appearance as a triangle. Descartes sees that making sense of mathematical appearances of physical phenomena requires a model that's more abstract than the traditional perception-inspired notion of resemblance. He crafts a concept of representation for just this purpose. The paradigm of representational relations are to be found in his algebraic geometry. He thinks of material reality as the realm of extension and takes it to consist of geometric properties, thus radicalizing Galileo by giving an ontological twist to his use of geometrical vocabulary. For Descartes, the real geometrical world of shapes and motions can best be represented by discursive sequences of symbols in the form of algebraic equations. The equations x squared plus y squared equals 1 and x equals y do not at all resemble, they're in no sense replicas of, the circle and the line that they represent. But they make it possible to reason about those figures, for instance, by computing the 2 points of intersection of that circle and that line. But how is the looser, more abstract representational relation to be understood? Giving up the bonds of resemblance by allowing representings to be so radically dissimilar to what they represent opens up a new skeptical possibility that reality is radically different from how it appears in representations of it. If representings and representeds don't need to share any properties, what is it that connects them? Descartes himself didn't offer much of an account. Mental states or episodes, he thought, are intrinsically representational. It's their nature to be tanquam rem, as if of things, as it's the nature of physical things to be extended. It was Spinoza, I think, whose first book was on Descartes, who figured out the concept of representation that was implicit in the motivating paradigm of algebraic geometry. The key is that, as he puts it, algebraic equations can represent geometrical figures because the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. Those equations can represent the geometrical figures because the whole system of equations is isomorphic to the whole system of figures, with, for instance, simultaneous solutions of equations corresponding to the intersections of lines. That's why algebraically manipulating equations is intelligible as reasoning about geometrical figures. Given that global isomorphism, what Spinoza called the order and connection of linear strings of symbols, that's the same as the order and connection of extended plane figures, the equation x squared plus y squared equals 1 can play the same functional role in the world of equations that the circle it thereby counts as representing plays in the world of geometrical figures. According to this story, the resemblance model was not wrong to take the sharing of properties to be essential to the ofness invoked by talk of appearances of material reality. Its mistake, the source of its expressive limitations, was to restrict attention to local properties, conceived atomistically, properties that elements of picturings and of what is pictured could have regardless of what properties other systematically related elements had. The wider scope of the new representational model is due to the holistic character of its appeal to global isomorphisms, which make visible functional correlations between items in the two systems that might have quite different atomistic material properties. The new, more abstract, and expressively powerful representational model of the intentional nexus between appearance and reality develops the older, more concrete resemblance model by shifting attention to the larger relational structures whose individual elements can be understood to play functional roles of representing and represented just in virtue of the global isomorphism between those structures. Representings and representeds can still be understood to share properties, but the properties are of a new functional kind, intelligible in principle only globally, in terms of relations to other representings or other representeds. This metaconceptual sea change from understanding the appearance-reality distinction in terms of the atomistic model of resemblance to using the more holistic model of representation introduced by Descartes is the first big episode that I need to have on the table in order to introduce my topic today. The second is Kant's further step away from the original perceptual paradigm to focus on specifically conceptual appearances. Descartes' new metaconcept of representation was sufficiently capacious to encompass both concepts and percepts, thoughts and sensations. His successors, rationalists and empiricists alike, had tried out the strategy of treating these two representations as extremes of a spectrum. Though they developed different understandings of the common dimension along which different sorts of representings are arrayed, rationalists as a matter of clarity and distinctness at the conceptual end and confusion at the perceptual end, empiricists as a matter of concreteness and vivacity at the perceptual end and abstractness at the conceptual end, still both schools saw thoughts and sensations as tied together by a variety of intermediate cases that make up a unifying spectrum of which they were conceived as extremes. For Kant, this quantitative scaling approach is an unsatisfactory framework in which to analyze the qualitatively different sorts of contributions to empirical knowledge that are made by representations of the two kinds. Those differences in function are sufficiently stark, he thinks, to justify treating them as the products of wholly distinct cognitive faculties. Kant's bold strategy is to understand the functional division of labor between those faculties hylomorphically, with sensibility contributing empirical content and the understanding contributing the intelligible conceptual form of empirical cognitions. He accordingly faces a new question. What does it mean to say that in the representings that are the appearance of represented reality, empirical content shows up in specifically conceptual form? To address this question adequately, Kant needs to rethink the wider realm of discursive activities in general, within which concepts play their distinctive functional role. It includes both the application of concepts in judgment and the use of judgments in reasoning. Here he could help himself to a robust logical tradition. The scholastics, seconded by the Port-Royal logicians, envisaged a methodological hierarchy relating these components. Its most basic level is a doctrine of concepts, particular and general. And on top of that is built a doctrine of judgments, classified according to the kinds of concepts they deploy. And on top of that is constructed a doctrine of inferences, codified in the form of syllogisms, classified according to the kinds of judgments that serve as their premises and conclusions. In order to adapt and extend this structure to address not only the traditional general logic, but also what he called transcendental logic, which is tasked with understanding the specifically representational dimension of concept use, in the light of the holistic lessons that Spinoza and Leibniz had taught about the importance of the systematic order and connection of ideas to understanding representation, Kant needed to turn that logical tradition on its head. My hero Wilfrid Sellars said of this crucial move, Kant was on the right track when he insisted that just as concepts are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in judgments, so judgments, and therefore indirectly concepts, are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. In fact, Kant recruits the structure of the traditional atomistic bottom-up account and deploys it in the service of a holistic, functional, top-down account of discursiveness. Concepts, he says, are functions of judgment. They must be understood in terms of the role they play in activities of judging. Judgments, not concepts, are the minimal units of discursive awareness, what, following Leibniz, he calls apperception. Judgments are indeed, as the tradition had it, applications of concepts. But we're to understand applying concepts in terms of an antecedent understanding of what judging is, not the other way around. And at the center of Kant's revolutionary reconceptualization of the discursive is accordingly his new account of the activity of judging. He understands judging as taking up a distinctive kind of normative stance, undertaking responsibility, committing oneself. He further understands the normative status taken on in judging as a task responsibility, a commitment to do something, to engage in a distinctive kind of activity. Concepts are then to be made intelligible as rules for determining what one is taking responsibility for or committing oneself to by making the judgments that are the applications of those concepts. What one becomes responsible for doing in making a judgment is integrating it into a constellation of doxastic commitments that has a distinctive kind of unity, a rational, systematic unity. One obligation undertaking and endorsing a new claim is securing the coherence of one's commitments by extruding rationally incompatible ones from the ensemble. Another is to expand the system by acknowledging the consequences of one's judgments, and by identifying other judgments that justify one's commitments by providing reasons for them. Constellations of commitments governed by these critical, ampliative, and justificatory rational task responsibilities have the unity that Kant sees as distinctive of apperception, that is, discursive, specifically conceptual awareness, sapience, not merely sentience. His generic term for the rational, norm-governed discursive activities that confer conceptual form is synthesis. In the first instance, what's synthesized is a constellation of commitments having the kind of rational unity characteristic of apperception. The conceptual contents of judgments, the most basic kind of conceptual representation, are their potentials for being integrated into wholes that have that kind of synthetic unity. Rational synthetic activity results, Kant tells us, in the transcendental unity of apperception. It's a transcendental unity in the sense studied by transcendental logic, a unity that makes intelligible the representational dimension of judgment and discursive understanding generally. The challenge Kant faces is accordingly to derive an account of the relations between representing appearances and represented realities from such a top-down functional account of the activities and processes that structure the rational, norm-governed, conceptual order and connection of ideas. By elaborating in this way the underlying idea of conceptual form as conferred by role in activities of reasoning, Kant crafted a powerful new conception of the conceptual. It includes an original account of what any subject, looking ahead, we have to think about AI, must be able to do to count as thinking. That is, to count as aware in a way that essentially involves discursive understanding. This is apperception, being appeared to in a distinctively conceptual sense of appearance. These ideas were of the utmost significance for subsequent German idealism and later American pragmatism, starting with Peirce. My main topic for the rest of the talk today is how they can be developed and deployed to address issues that we still wrestle with. But already in the form to which Kant brought them, a disadvantage becomes visible of tying conceptual form so closely to the reasoning activities of apperceiving subjects. For however successful or promising a construal of conceptual form in terms of role of reasoning might be, as an account of the conceptual form of appearances, it seems in principle restricted to accounting for conceptual representings. It's not clear on this account what it could even mean for the reality that appearance represents also to have or to be in conceptual form. How could conceptual form, in Kant's sense, be the order and connection that's shared by the system of representings and the system of representeds on the Descartes-inspired Spinozist holistic construal of representation? On the face of it, things in the objective world do not in general play functional roles in rational practices of acknowledging how some judgments provide reasons for and against others. Understanding the conceptual form of judgments or judgeable contents to consist in the role they play in such norm-governed rational activities restricts conceptual form to the appearance side of the appearance-reality distinction. We can characterize any view that restricts conceptual articulation to the realm of appearance conceptual phenomenalism. And by contrast, we could use conceptual realism to describe accounts of conceptual structure that discern it on both ends of the relations between discursive representings and what they represent. In these terms, Kant is a conceptual phenomenalist. And of course, Kant fully understands and enthusiastically embraces this conclusion. It's the core of his transcendental idealism. Since conceptual form is for him exclusively the product of the rational activities of the faculty of the understanding, it follows that it's restricted to our representings. It can characterize the reality the representings that constitute discursive appearances represent only as represented. That is, only as it exists in and according to those representings, not as a matter of deep Kantian principle, how what is represented is in itself, that is, apart from representings of it. As I put the point a bit earlier, on the Kantian conception of the conceptual, we don't even understand what it would mean for reality as it is apart from our representing activities to be in conceptual shape. That's why, for Kant, the world as we conceptually represent it in our judgments and beliefs can't be understood to be transcendentally real. It must be thought of as only ideal transcendentally and real only empirically. That is, as being what we take it to be only in our representings of it. The important claim here is that conceptual phenomenalism, in the form of transcendental idealism, seems to be entailed by the conjunction of Spinoza's holistic functional account of the forms shared by veridical systems of representings and what they represent, with Kant's account of the conceptual form of discursive representings in terms of the role they play in the reasoning of representers. With this claim, I've at last arrived at the principal question that's the subject of the rest of my remarks here. That is, how we may understand conceptually realistic views, which reject the restriction of conceptual form to the realm of appearance in the sense of the products of our rational representational activity. Since I introduced the issue by offering a pedigree for Kant's conceptual phenomenalism that begins with large-scale features of the appearance-reality distinction, it's worth noting that in the broadest terms along this dimension, Kant turns Plato on his head. It's Ryan Simonelli who taught me to think about things this way. For Plato contrasted a reality that's intelligible just in virtue of its conceptual form to its sensible, non-conceptual appearance, whose resemblance to that intelligible reality is hard enough to grasp that it requires heavy-duty philosophizing to make it visible. Both Kant's picture of conceptual appearance and non-conceptual reality, and Plato's complementary picture of conceptual reality and non-conceptual appearance, stand in opposition to views that I'm calling conceptually realist, which attribute conceptual articulation both to reality and to its appearance to concept users, both to what discursive activity represents and to conceptual representings of it. This is Hegel's starting point in the phenomenology, and I've put a telling quote from him on the handout, but I'm not going to discuss Hegel here. But John McDowell's masterwork, Mind and World, can be understood as botanizing various pathologies that result from rejecting conceptual realism. For taking it that, as McDowell puts it, the realm of the conceptual has an outer boundary, marking the cleavage of mind from the world. In order to be entitled to take the reality we think and talk about as rationally and not merely causally constraining our representings of it, McDowell argues, we must understand that world, and not just our minds, as already in conceptual form. The challenge is to say how one must understand the conceptual in order to make good on that aspiration. Kant explicitly recoils from one strategy for reconciling conceptual realism with a restriction of the conceptual to representings. That's the view that represented reality consists entirely of representings, that the world is thinkable because it consists of thinkings. He rejects both what he calls the subjective idealism of Berkeley, with its single divine world thinker as the source of representable representings, and Leibniz's monadological plenum of representing representers. If we agree with Kant in spurning these extravagant approaches, must we also renounce conceptual realism and agree with Kant in settling for conceptual phenomenalism in the form of some sort of transcendental idealism? I think the conceptual phenomenalist threat and the corresponding conceptual realist aspiration is maybe best evoked by the chorus in Wallace Stevens' poem, The Blue Guitar. They said, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." And the man replied, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar." And they said then, "But play you must, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves, a tune upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are." In what follows, I want to explore a way of playing that tune by sketching one form that conceptual realism could take. I'll do so in the context of the conviction that the two ideas that led to Kant's conceptual phenomenalism are good ideas, worth pursuing. That is, Spinoza's holist account of how thinking in terms of representation improves upon thinking in terms of resemblance in understanding the relations between appearance and reality holistically, and Kant's functionalist construal of conceptual form as conferred by role in reasoning. I'm going to consider how this last idea might be developed in the context of a third large movement of philosophical thought. That's the focus on specifically linguistic expressions as the most basic kind of conceptual representation. After the linguistic turn, pragmatic functionalism of the sort that Kant pioneers takes the form of an interest in how the use of linguistic expressions can be understood to confer meaning on them. I use the term pragmatics in a very broad sense to refer to the study of the use of linguistic expressions in discursive social practices. In this sense, I'll be pursuing a pragmatics first order of explanation, seeking to understand the representational dimension of conceptual content in terms of such practices. This is the strategy that led Kant to his phenomenalist restriction of the conceptual to the appearance side of the appearance-reality distinction. But my aim is to evade that phenomenalist conclusion and its repugnant consequence that in the end it's not so much as intelligible that we should ever know things as they are in themselves, that is, as they are independently of our conceptual representational activity. A first step is to heed the wise scholastic advice. When faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. The distinction that's wanted here is between reasoning practices and what I'll call reasoning relations. It's one that my teacher Gil Harman taught us in the course of arguing for what seemed like an outrageous conclusion, that there is no such thing as deductive reasoning. Or slightly more carefully put, that deductive logic does not provide rules for reasoning. If it did, Harman observes, surely a central one would be something like, if you accept both P and if P then Q, then you should accept Q. But that would be a terrible rule. You might have much better evidence against Q than you have either for P or for P and Q, or for if P then Q. And if so, you ought to reject one of them rather than accept Q. The lesson is that we should understand deductive logic as characterizing relations of implication, expressed in logical vocabulary using conditionals, and incompatibility, expressed in logical vocabulary using negation. The relations logic articulates normatively constrain reasoning practices, but they don't directly dictate what we should do. I think this distinction between reason relations and reasoning practices can be exploited to yield a version of Kant's ideas that leads to an attractive and illuminating sort of conceptual realism, rather than to a conceptual phenomenalism that's objectionable because it semantically precludes representational knowledge of how a non-conceptual represented world really is, apart from its appearance in the form of conceptual representings of it. To go forward, it'll be helpful to look more closely at how reason relations of implication and incompatibility show up in a simple model of discursive practice. For Kant, the fundamental conceptual form of representation is judgments, representings that are judgings. A good thing to mean by specifically discursive practice is accordingly social practices in which some performances are treated as having the practical significance of claimings, sayings that things are thus and so. Declarative sentences are linguistic expressions whose freestanding utterance has that default significance of asserting or denying. We can ask, what is that practical significance? Following Kant's clue, connecting conceptual form to role in reasoning, we can understand making a claim as taking up a position in what Sellers called the space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Claiming is undertaking a distinctive kind of commitment, a commitment to accept or reject. It's a commitment the speaker's rational entitlement to which is always open to question. It's always potentially up for grabs. Discursive practice is essentially, and not just accidentally, a critical, rational practice. When someone makes a claim, it's liable to rational challenge. A challenge is a further claim, whose effect, if successful, is to suspend entitlement to that commitment. That entitlement can be redeemed by producing further claims that justify the challenged commitment. The basic epistemological structure of this minimal practice is what I've elsewhere called a default and challenge structure of entitlement. Discursive practice in this minimal model consists of undertaking commitments and challenging and defending entitlement to them, with participants' understanding of what's going on consisting in their practically keeping track of who's committed and entitled to what as the conversation continues. I call this a minimal model of discursive practice because I think it describes the minimal structure of practices within which some performances are pragmatically intelligible as claimings, and that's capable of conferring on the acts, attitudes, and linguistic expressions playing suitable roles in such practices, semantically recognizable as possessing specifically conceptual contents. Practices that do not accord some performances the pragmatic significance of claimings are not discursive in the sense I'm delineating. Simple as it is, this stripped-down model of discursive practice shows how we can understand reason relations in terms of the role they play in reasoning practices. Defending a claim is making other claims that collectively offer reasons for it. In the basic case, reasons to accept it. Challenging a claim is making other claims that collectively offer reasons against it. In the basic case, reasons to reject it. And implicit in these practices are two kinds of reason relations, those that determine what's a reason for what, and those that determine what's a reason against what. These are relations of implication and incompatibility. What stand in those relations are claimables, what can be asserted or denied, doxastically accepted or rejected. We may think of those claimables as conceptually contentful just insofar as they stand to one another in relations of implication and incompatibility. Those relations articulate norms governing assessments of what claimables are reasons for and against which others, by determining which claimings provide reasons to accept and which provide reasons to reject other claimings. Now, the reason relations we're talking about are not relations of logical consequence and inconsistency. They're what Sellers calls material rather than formal logical, in the sense that they articulate the contents of non-logical concepts. As the goodness of the implication from Pittsburgh is to the west of New York to New York is to the east of Pittsburgh is part of the meaning of the concepts of east and west. Indeed, the order of explanation I'm pursuing introduces logical vocabulary later in the game in order to make those reason relations explicit in the form of claimable sentences. The conditional has the job of making explicit in claimable form implication relations, and negation has the job of making incompatibilities explicit in claimable form. Nonetheless, the way forward I want to pursue in further specifying the relations between the dyads accept, reject, defend, challenge, and implication incompatibility builds on a particular view in the philosophy of logic, bilateralist, normative, pragmatic accounts of implication. It'll give us a clearer view of how reason relations may be understood as precipitating out of inferential practices of rationally challenging and defending claimings. Greg Restall introduced, and David Ripley further developed, the bilateral normative pragmatic metavocabulary that I'll be building on in order to explain multi-conclusion implications in sequent calculi. That's what they want. It extends easily to an account of incompatibility, and the points I want to make don't require us to look beyond single conclusion inferences. On this account, what you're doing when you say that a premise set of sentences gamma implies a sentence A is to rule normatively out of bounds the constellation of claimings in which one accepts all of gamma and rejects A. Dually, we can say that gamma is incompatible with A, just in case commitment to accept all of gamma normatively rules out commitment to accept A. In keeping with the Harman point, This normative assessment does not say what someone who's in that position should do. It says only that one cannot be jointly entitled to all these commitments. Reason relations of consequence and incompatibility are understood in terms of states of being out of bounds. It distinguishes sets of doxastic commitments to accept and reject to which one cannot simultaneously be entitled. That only constrains and does not settle how one should alter one's commitments so as to come back into bounds, to repair one's attitudes, so that one's commitments to accept and reject rationally cohere. That is, cohere according to the reason relation of implication and incompatibility, so one can be jointly entitled to them. This is recognizably a version of Kant's specification of the sort of synthetic rational unity that he took to be characteristic of conceptual discursive apperception. If we combine this bilateralist thought with the minimal model of discursive practice, we get a picture of how reason relations of implication and incompatibility are normatively related to practices of asserting and denying declarative sentences, which express practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection, and rationally defending and challenging entitlement to the commitments undertaken by those acts and attitudes. The reason relations among claimables articulate global constraints on the coherence of constellations of commitments to accept and reject claimables by determining which such constellations one can be jointly entitled to. And that in turn settles which claimings count as providing reasons for, and hence potential defenses of, which others, and which claimings count as providing reasons against, and hence potential challenges to, which others. Those relations can be exploited synthetically by using a given set of reason relations to determine which moves in a language game are licit, for instance, which challenges and defenses should count as successful, or it can be exploited analytically by determining the reason relations from the practical normative assessments of moves in a given discursive practice. Sellers argues that the important difference between describing by applying concepts and mere labeling as non-conceptual classification consists in the situation of descriptions in a space of implications. The suggestion I'm pursuing is that we understand the conceptual contents of claimables in terms of their situation in the role they play with respect to a space of reason relations, of implications and incompatibilities. Doing so promises progress on the way to a version of conceptual realism insofar as it contributes to a non-psychological conception of the conceptual, one that does not restrict it to the products of discursive practices. To fulfill that promise, we'll have to show how the conception of relations of consequence and incompatibility that are introduced and understood to begin with in terms of their role in normatively governing discursive practices of asserting and denying, challenging and defending, the rational credentials of those acts and the doxastic attitudes and commitments they express, can be found on the side of the objective reality represented by those subjective activities of manipulating representings. It's not yet clear that following Harman and distinguishing relations of implication and incompatibility from practices of inferring, giving reasons for and against, so defending, challenging, or claimings, does make such progress. It might be admitted that it usefully fills in Spinoza's notion of the order and connection of ideas in a way that respects Kant's insights both into the normative character of that order and connection and into the specifically conceptual character of the ideas so related. For I've not yet said anything about the transcendental, that is, the representational dimension of those practices, and so not about the order and connection of represented things. Kant thought the rational synthesis of a normatively inbounds constellation of doxastic commitments produced the transcendental unity characteristic of apperception, that is, conceptual appearance, representings in conceptual form. What is it about the critical rational processes of challenging and defending, normatively governed by reason relations determining what constellations of commitments one can become jointly entitled to, that establishes representational relations? Another manifestation of this same issue is that I've said nothing about truth. Among the various dyads that structure the minimal model of discursive practice I outlined, we find acceptance and rejection, assertion and denial, reasons for and against, implication and incompatibility, but not truth or falsity. The practical attitude of accepting a claimable can be paraphrased as taking true, and that of rejecting as taking false, but nothing I've put in place so far gives any representational substance to those otherwise empty paraphrases. So let's turn our attention from pragmatics to semantics, from concern with the use of linguistic expressions by discursive subjects to looking at the representational dimension of the conceptual content, which relates them to the objective world as conceptual representings, appearances of a represented reality. The most sophisticated and expressively powerful contemporary representational formal semantic framework is Kit Fine's Truthmaker semantics. It begins with a metaphysical picture of what there is to be represented semantically. That universe consists of a structured collection of what he calls states. The formal apparatus is as non-committal as possible about what those states consist in, but states are meant to include such ways things could be as Pittsburgh's being to the west of New York City and snow being white. The universe of states is thought of as having two sorts of structure, mereological and modal. On the mereological side, some states are to be understood as parts of others. More formally, there's a fusion operation that maps any set of states into a whole comprising them. This defines the whole-part relation. State A is part of state B, just in case B is the result of fusing state A with some other states. On the modal side, the universe of states is for Fine partitioned into possible and impossible states. Mereologically and modally structured state spaces generalize the metaphysics of possible worlds in a number of important ways. Possible worlds show up in this framework as maximal possible states such that every other state is either part of that state or incompatible with it, in the sense that fusing it with the world state yields an impossible state. On the modal side, state spaces in general include multiple impossible states, where in the possible world setting, in effect, there's only one. On the mereological side, various structural conditions can be put on the fusion operation, for instance, requiring that all the states that contain any impossible state are themselves impossible. That is, that the result of fusing any state with an impossible state is always also an impossible state. Like the existence of multiple impossible states, the capacity to consider different kinds of mereological structures is a major degree of freedom in the apparatus, enhancing the expressive power of the Truthmaker framework. This metaphysical specification of what there is to be represented is then married to a flexible and powerful representational semantics. An interpretation function assigns each declarative sentence to a pair of sets of states, thought of as the exact truth makers and falsity makers of that sentence. Rather than simply defining one of these sets in terms of the other, one can put various explicit structural constraints on the sets of verifiers and falsifiers that are assigned to declarative sentences as their semantic interpretants. One might be tempted to require just that they be disjoint, that no state is both a truth maker and a falsity maker of any sentence. Fine requires rather that the fusion of any truth maker with any false maker of the same sentence must be an impossible state. He calls this condition exclusivity. It entails the cognate, but usefully different requirement that any states that are both truth makers and false makers of the same sentence be impossible states. Some statements, say all cows are made of glass, say all cows are made of glass, and this neutrino has a mass of 500 kilograms, might have only impossible truth makers, but they're not required to have the same impossible states as truth makers. The combination of the mereological and modal fineness of grain of the underlying metaphysics and keeping separate books on the truth makers and falsity makers that semantically interpret sentences results in a hyper-intentional theory of meaning, which is much more expressively powerful in virtue of making many more distinctions than its possible world's predecessor. To count as a semantics, in the sense of an account of the conceptual contents that sentences express, the truthmaker framework must permit the definition of reason relations, of implication and incompatibility. Fine offers two principal ways one might define consequence, among other possibilities, and counts it as a virtue of the system that there are such alternatives. He says that a set of sentences gamma entails a conclusion A in case every verifier of all the premises in gamma is also a verifier of A. He says that A is a consequence of gamma in the sense of containment if every verifier of A includes as a part a verifier of all of gamma, and every verifier of all of gamma is a part of a verifier of A. Corresponding definitions of incompatibility are not far to seek. My principal concern here, as might be expected from the preamble, is with how best to understand reason relations in the truthmaker framework. I'll return to that topic shortly to criticize Fine's candidates and to offer a constructive suggestion as to how those definitions might be improved upon. First, let me revert briefly to the metaphysics to make an observation about how it looks once we've used it to supply semantic interpretants for sentences. For, as Fine observes, the overall picture underwrites a striking realism about the propositional contents expressed by declarative sentences. Such contents are just pairs of sets of states that meet whatever structural conditions we impose on such pairs to make them eligible to serve as truth makers and false makers of sentences. Paradigmatically, exclusivity, which requires that all fusions of elements of the first set with elements of the second set be impossible states. Fine proposes to call any pair of sets of states that meet that condition a proposition, since it's then eligible to serve as an interpretant of the sentence. But even in the implausible case where there's only a countably infinite number of states, there'll be uncountably many pairs of sets of them that meet the minimal structural conditions for propositionality. So there'll be far more propositions than any natural or formal language, in the ordinary sense, could possibly have sentences to express. And those worldly propositions stand to one another in relations of consequence, for instance, entailment or containment in Fine's sense, and incompatibility, since those notions are defined in terms of the metaphysical, mereological, and modal properties of the paired sets of states. As a result, Fine's semantic and metaphysical picture is a conceptually realist one. The world that's there to be represented by our linguistic representings of it, however incompletely and imperfectly, is always already conceptually structured. Antecedently to and independently of our discursive practices, reality for Fine is already in conceptual shape, in the sense of exhibiting structures that stand to one another in reason relations of consequence and incompatibility. I've drawn from the tradition the suggestion that a good way to demarcate specifically conceptual contentfulness is precisely standing in such relations. The conceptual form consists in being locatable in a constellation of items so related to one another. On Fine's account of linguistic representation, what Spinoza called the order and connection of things, one side of the isomorphism with the order and connection of ideas that he saw as necessary and sufficient for representation, itself exhibits the specifically conceptual structure that consists in being articulated by reason relations of material that is non-logical, consequence, and incompatibility. And of course, this conceptual realism is achieved without recourse to the Berkeley-Leibniz heroic but metaphysically extravagant stratagem of understanding the reality that's there to be represented as in conceptual shape because it itself consists entirely of representings. Contemporary philosophers should be accustomed to conceptual realism in the sense in which it's on offer in Fine's framework, because it's already present in the possible worlds framework that is its predecessor. In neither case does the account of worldly propositions standing in objective relations of consequence and incompatibility depend on or owe anything to an account of the use of linguistic expressions or concepts. That, recall, is the feature of Kant's view that led to his contrasting conceptual phenomenalism in the form of transcendental idealism. Indeed, the truthmaker semantics could not be conceptually phenomenalist in this sense, because Fine's story doesn't include any account of the use of expressions. He doesn't say anything about what linguistic practitioners must do in order thereby to count as using declarative sentences so as to associate with them sets of truth makers and falsity makers. There is no native pragmatics that goes with Fine's semantics and metaphysics. There is accordingly no analog in Fine's setting of the connection between the two phenomena Harman taught us to distinguish: reason relations on the one hand and norms governing practices of reasoning on the other, of the sort that we saw the Restall-Ripley bilateralism under Wright. But this failing can easily and usefully be remedied, and showing how this lacuna can be filled in is my principal purpose here. As a first step, we might notice that Fine's definitions of consequence relations don't make anything like full use of the mereological and modal innovations that principally distinguish his framework from the possible world semantics it improves upon. Taking it that premise set gamma entails conclusion A, just in case all the verifiers of all of gamma are verifiers of A, just translates the set theoretic inclusion criterion of consequence in the possible world setting without adding anything of substance to it. His notion of containment exploits the mereological structure of his metaphysics, but not its modal structure. Ulf Lobel shows us how to do better. We can take our cue from Fine's exclusivity condition, relating verifiers and falsifiers of the same sentence, so of the same proposition. It requires that every fusion of any verifiers and any falsifiers be an impossible state. Ulf suggests that we take gamma to imply A just in case every fusion of any verifiers of all of gamma with any falsifiers of A is an impossible state. This analog of exclusivity then shows up just as the reflexivity of the consequence relation. Like exclusivity, this definition of consequence appeals both to the mereological and to the modal structure of the universe of states from which the semantic interpretants of sentences are drawn. The corresponding notion of incompatibility requires the fusion of any verifiers of all of gamma with any verifier of A to be an impossible state. The key point is that this semantic definition of implication lines up perfectly with the bilateral pragmatic definition of implication. Lobel's version of consequence, implication in the truthmaker semantics, is 1. Gamma implies A if and only if any fusion of a state that verifies all the members of gamma with a state that falsifies A is an impossible state. And the Restall-Ripley normative pragmatic reading of implication is 2. Gamma implies A if and only if any position that includes accepting all of gamma and rejecting A is normatively incoherent or out of bounds. As we've read it, one cannot be entitled to such a constellation of commitments. And their corresponding semantic and pragmatic notions of incompatibility. Indeed, Lobel proves that with these definitions, the reason relations defined semantically in Fine's truthmaker setting are isomorphic with those defined pragmatically in the bilateral normative setting. Further, the isomorphism permits the intertranslation of logical vocabulary introduced in the pragmatic setting by sequent calculus rules with those introduced semantically in the truthmaker setting by the sorts of rules Fine uses, so that the isomorphism is also preserved for logical extensions of pre-logical languages and indeed for a wide variety of logics. I mean, I'm just in awe of this result of Ulf's and mostly expanding my appreciation of it here. The Lobel isomorphism between suitably tweaked versions of Fine's truthmaker representational semantics and Restall and Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatics supplies an answer to the question that Fine's framework by itself does not answer. for it tells us what practitioners must do, how they must use expressions in order to confer on them the conceptual contents that Fine assigns them in terms of truth makers and falsity makers, up to isomorphism of reason relations. In order to associate verifiers and falsifiers with expressions as their semantic interpretants, practitioners must use those expressions according to the bilateral pragmatics, distinguishing in practice between constellations of commitments to accept and reject claimables that are normatively in bounds and those that are normatively out of bounds. And that includes expecting anyone who's precluded from being jointly entitled to the doxastic commitments they've practically undertaken to acknowledge the obligation to alter those commitments so as to repair the situation and find their way back in bounds. By forging this tight structural connection between the norm-governed use of declarative sentences and their representational meaning, the isomorphism that Lobel demonstrates specifies the structure of reason relations that is the same for the order and connection of ideas, or representings, on the pragmatic side, and the order and connection of things, or representeds, on the metaphysical side. This is the holistic structural condition that, given his foregrounding of the analytic algebraic geometry model, Spinoza's Descartes takes representation relations of the sort Fine specifies to consist in. Truthmaker semantics by itself only addresses the worldly side. The structural isomorphism of bilateral pragmatics with that semantics at the level of reason relations completes the Spinozist picture. It shows the structure of reason relations common to takings true of sentences by discursive subjects, that is the subject of bilateral pragmatics, and the making true of sentences by worldly objects, that is the subject of Fine's semantics. It's important that the isomorphism, and so the correspondence between representings and representeds, is specified to begin with not at the level of sentences and facts, or terms and objects, but at the higher level of reason relations. That is, on the linguistic side, it's at the level of meaning, not at the level of truth. The common structure we've discerned doesn't depend on what anyone is actually doxastically committed to on the pragmatic side of representings, nor on what states are actual or factual on the semantic side of represented reality. It's not a correspondence theory of truth. Rather, the sort of conceptual realism it underwrites is a transcendental presupposition of the possibility of correspondence theories of truth. The idea of coherence theories of truth was always the result of misunderstanding of holistic theories of meaning. Truth of sentences as correspondence to reality is a local property, appropriate to atomistic categories of resemblance, rather than the holistic categories of representation presupposed at the level of meaning, on which it turns out to depend. The key is understanding the specifically conceptual form of the content of sentential representings in terms of their situation in a network of reason relations of consequence and incompatibility. We saw how the Restall-Ripley bilateral normative pragmatics can be used to put some practical social-linguistic flesh on the bare bones of Kant's account of how norm-governed rational synthetic activities confer conceptual form on the doxastic commitments that show up for him as judgings. Because that story defines conceptual form in terms of synthetic activities of concept-applying subjects, Kant saw no way to avoid a conceptual phenomenalism that restricts the conceptual to the representing side of the intentional nexus. The global isomorphism between the variants we've considered of the Restall-Ripley bilateral normative pragmatics and Fine's truthmaker representational semantics, though, shows how Kant's idea can be made compatible with conceptual realism that discerns conceptual form on the side of what's represented, as well as what can be understood as representings of it, precisely in virtue of the conceptual content that they share. That shared conceptual structure is holistically defined in terms of reason relations. And what makes possible this extension of the idea of conceptual structure from representings to representeds, as required by conceptual realism, is precisely the Harman distinction between reason relations and reasoning practices. So, I've adopted here a pragmatics first order of explanation, which explains what reason relations are and why they're reason relations by appeal to their role in articulating norms governing practices of rationally challenging and defending doxastic commitments. It's appropriate to understand reason relations as such first in their relation to what doxastic practitioners do, just as Kant thought. You got to start with reasoning. But he was wrong to think that such a dependence at the level of sense, of our conception of the conceptual, on our understanding of activities of reasoning, entails that at the level of reference, items cannot be in conceptual form unless that form is imposed by rational activities. In Fine's mereological modal metaphysics, propositions as pairs of sets of states that are eligible to serve as truth makers and false makers of declarative sentences would stand to one another in relations of consequence and incompatibility, even if there never had been and never would be concept users deploying sentential representings with those truth and falsity conditions. The roles with respect to reason relations that are shareable between items caught up in discursive practices of claiming and defending and challenging claims on the one hand, and constellations of worldly states that can be thought of and constellations of worldly states can be thought of as rational forms in a recognizably neo-Aristotelian sense. And Ulf is their prophet. They are rational forms precisely in being roles things play in structures of reason relations. They are essentially modal forms, for both essentially appeal to a notion of preclusion. The impropriety, out of boundness, of a collection of concomitant commitments, or the impossibility of a state resulting from the fusion of other states. In both cases, consequence is a matter of a kind of necessitation, and incompatibility a matter of a kind of exclusion. The isomorphism shows that modal relations can correspond exactly. But the kinds of modality involved in the pragmatics of representing and the metaphysics of representeds in the semantics are systematically different. The modality that articulates the reason relations implicit in the use of declarative sentences is a deontic modality, while that articulating the reason relations implicit in the modalized mereological universe of states is an alethic modality. On the pragmatic side of claimings, the claim that the coin is made of copper is materially incompatible with the claim that the coin is an electrical insulator. The modal ruling out involved in this kind of incompatibility is normative. One cannot be entitled to commitments to accept both those claimables. It's possible to do so, but it's not correct or appropriate. The state consisting of the coins being made of copper and the state consisting of the coins being an electrical insulator are incompatible in the different, alethic modal sense that the combination of them that is their metaphysical fusion is impossible. Both the order and connection of ideas and the order and connection of things consists of modally robust reason relations. In the one case, deontic normative, in the other case, alethic modal. The view I'm recommending is accordingly a bimodal conceptual realism. Thereon hangs a tale, but my purpose here has only been to bring us to the gates of that promised land. I began my story with the large-scale shift in the structure of conceptions of the appearance-reality distinction that was motivated by the rise of the new mathematized sciences, the shift from understanding it in terms of resemblance to understanding it in terms of representation. Descartes was the hero here, and I particularly emphasized the holistic structural lesson about global isomorphism as the essence of representation that Spinoza drew from Descartes. Kant then focuses attention on the fact that reality shows up for us sapient creatures in specifically conceptual form, in discursive representations. I suggested that Spinoza's insight gives us reason to want to avoid the dual mistakes of Plato and Kant, each of whom lined up the appearance-reality distinction with the distinction between what is and is not in specifically conceptual shape, disagreeing just about whether it was reality or appearance that was on the conceptual side of the gulf that they excavated between them. The way forward I recommended appeals to a notion of rational forms shareable between the intellect appeared to and the reality that appears to it. This was Aristotle's response to Plato on this point, and it's an interesting exercise to read what Hegel calls idealism in his phenomenology as a conceptual realism in this sense, one that shows up in a post-Kantian shape downstream from Descartes and Spinoza's holistic lessons. My response to that challenge is laid out in A Spirit of Trust. The particularly contemporary versions of this conceptually realist strategy that I sketched here began by using Gil Harman's distinction between activities or practices of reasoning and reason relations to adapt Kant's insight into the nature of conceptual form so as to avoid the conceptual phenomenalism that Kant properly saw was entailed by his version, which didn't make that distinction. I called on Greg Restall's and David Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatics for sequent calculi to clarify the relations between norms of reasoning and reason relations of consequence and incompatibility in discursive practices of making claims and defending and challenging them by offering reasons for and against those claims. Kit Fine's truth-maker semantics and its associated mereological modal metaphysics then provided a model of reality represented by the sentences whose verifiers and falsifiers it provided. A powerful formal result of O'Flobel's subsequently shows how to line up alethic modal relations of consequence and incompatibility in Fine's semantic structure with the deontic normative reason relations construed by the bilateral pragmatics. The resulting bimodal conceptual realism, with rational forms defined functionally, so holistically, as roles with respect to reason relations, which we can understand as amphibious between representing appearance and represented reality, shows how it's possible to play a tune beyond us, yet ourselves, a tune upon a conceptual blue guitar of things exactly as they are. Thank you.